this is fantastic. I'm glad to see so many people here and to be able to talk about my research on the Philippines. Thanks to the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Mary, for inviting me to this Friday forum, to Tyrrell and the Justice in Southeast Asia Lab for enabling me to come to Madison to work on my book and to be with you today. The talk is actually, this is a chapter from my book, and my sources, the sources that I used to write this book, largely are drawn from a Commission on Human Rights records, case investigations of murders, or rather extrajudicial killings, forced disappearances, torture, but mostly extrajudicial killings, submissions to the International Criminal Court that have not been published, as well as daily newspaper scans, NGO reports, and so on. Before I begin, I need to give you a trigger warning. I will be describing brutal murder in the course of this discussion. Okay, so Rodrigo Duterte, I trust is a familiar enough name. He was elected president. He campaigned specifically on a promise of bloodshed. He vowed to translate onto a national scale his tough on crime tactics from Davao City, where he was a long-time mayor. The International Criminal Court, or ICC, prosecutor has estimated that, or finds credible, estimates that around 12,000 to 30,000 people were killed in this national war on drugs that he implemented as soon as he came into office. And some typical ways of how the war on drugs unfolded: many people were killed in the wee hours of morning between midnight and 3 a.m., usually in drive-by shootings. They were, or raids, or police raids. In many cases, especially in the beginning, bodies were found staged on the streets with placards or signs that said, "Pusher ako, addict ako, wag tudaran," which means I'm a drug pusher or I'm a drug addict, don't end up like me. The official count from the police says that around 6,235 were killed as of February 2022. But that excludes thousands of unexplained homicides, also from police data. So this, make no mistake, was a campaign of state terror. And sadly, we've seen these kinds of performances of political violence just in Southeast Asia as well. In the 80s, in Indonesia, under former President Suharto, somewhere between an estimated 2,000 up to 10,000 people were killed over a couple of years in what were known as the mysterious shootings, usually targeting criminals. In Thailand, around 2,800 so-called drug criminals were killed in former Prime Minister Thaksin's war on drugs. But in the Philippines, this level of mass violence was unprecedented. Even in comparison to martial law, when the Philippines was under the Marcos dictatorship, there's an estimated 2,000 over extrajudicial killings. So even compared to the low end of the estimate by the police of 6,000 over killings in the war on drugs, you can see how the scale of violence has gone out of proportion. So the question that I try to answer is, why did it emerge as the dominant form of political violence in recent years? Nicole Curato argues that part of the reason why this national war on drugs prospered was because it was popular. She uses the term penal populism, a sort of politics that are punitive and that people wanted it. And other scholars have used this idea to also explain the violence and why it ratcheted up. The problem with that is there's a need for a logistical explanation as well. How did suddenly thousands of people, how did they suddenly, end up dead on the streets? And so you can see here the shape of the violence, this is closer to the lower range estimate because it also corresponds to names and locations. But you can see that it was in the initial months of the war on drugs that the violence peaked. And I'll talk more about this later. The dots in black are actual deaths on a weekly basis, and the yellow ones are predictions based on a model. So it gives you an idea that there was a concentration of violence in the beginning before it petered out. But still, how did thousands of people get killed, or hundreds, at least hundreds of people get killed on a weekly basis? Sheila Coronel argues that it was possible because the national police as an institution was a ready, willing, and able killing machine. And there's a lot of evidence, even from journalistic accounts, to support our understanding of logistics of the national war on drugs. So barangay, well, that's the local name for an urban village or rural village, the barangay officials produce lists for the government, lists of names of supposed drug criminals. The police, of course, also produced lists of potential targets. And one of the craziest features of this war on drugs is that thousands of people surrendered themselves to the police, crowding jails, right? Because they thought that would save them from being killed on the street. It turned out that this was also another method of targeting people because a lot of those people also wound up getting killed in the war on drugs. So all of this was to create legitimacy around the claim that it was only criminals who deserved to be killed. Those were the only people who were getting killed, right? Now, in addition to that, there was also this false nanlaban narrative from the police. Nanlaban means, oh, he shot first, right? But actually, there's also more evidence that guns were planted, evidence were planted, probably by the police themselves. This gave the police perpetrators cover. There's also been documentation of financial incentives and quotas that motivated both police and vigilante perpetrators, driving up the numbers. Going back to Coronel, Sheila Coronel, she argues that the drug war was enabled by, therefore, existing forms of routine police brutality or police violence. Now that's an important part of the explanation. But what it doesn't explain is why, for instance, did the violence, it explains why the violence persisted, but not why it de-escalated, right? And a brief explanation there is that if you see this outlier, this one dot over here, that's the week that, for those of you who know the Philippines, this name will be familiar. That was the week Kian de los Santos was killed. And it sparked the first war on drugs protests, which are represented by the bars in yellow. This is the week he was killed. There were funeral processions, and so it took over a year of the violence. And sorry, the rest of the data are basically a mix of different kinds of protests. But it took more than a year for people to really come out into the street, for protests to multiply, finally to decry the war on drugs. This was because, in some part, this was because his death was caught on CCTV as police dragged him towards the alley where witnesses say he was shot, he was pleading for his life, he had an exam the next day. He was 17 years old when he was killed. And also, some of these protests coincided with the commemoration of the imposition of martial law in September 1972. So the institutional approach tells us how the killings escalated, their speed, the geographic concentration, but it doesn't explain why the violence emerged when it did, why it declined. And there is a bit of a cheeky explanation here. Before Duterte became president, why didn't anyone stop? Why was he never stopped? Why was he elevated to the highest office, given that there were several investigations into his lethal murderous activities as Davao City mayor? And he probably wasn't even the first mayor to get away, literally, probably, with murder. There was Alfredo Lim, who was mayor of Manila, the capital city, in the 90s, who is known for salvaging so-called criminal victims. Salvaging is sort of a local slang for extrajudicial killings. And there are other cities, especially urban areas, that have conducted these kinds of anti-crime campaigns. Now, what is less known, and which is what I want to talk about today, is that there have been other local anti-crime campaigns that were stopped by the police, by the government, right? And so that the contrast that I'll try to talking about Davao City with Tagum City, which was in nearby Davao del Norte, and in Gapan City in Central Luzon. The comparison between these cases and how Duterte basically used this anti-crime campaign to catapult himself into Malacanang, the presidential palace. That comparison helps us better understand why why the national campaign on drugs was even possible in the first place. So I'll start with Davao City, okay, which was known as the safest city in the country, except of course if you happen to be a suspected drug dealer or something. It was also the murder capital of the city. So when he was mayor when Rodrigo Duterte was Mayor Duterte, he actually, and he was mayor for the better part of 30 years basically. He avoided political repression and instead, hit upon this anti-crime campaign. He had essentially, or was linked to, what was his own private army. But unlike traditional politicians, right, this private army wasn't necessarily trained against rivals, except in very rare cases, which I'll talk about. And that also allowed him to fly below the radar, especially in the beginning, of controls over electoral violence, let's say. It was less visible by going after criminals instead of political opponents. So the formation of the Davao Death Squad dates back actually to when he first was elected mayor in 1988. Okay, he had narrowly won the election against a former ally of his named June Pala. Okay, a popular spokesperson at the time for an anti-communist group called Alsamasa. Alsamasa means arise, masses. It was an anti-communist vigilante group, actually. It had been set up by a Davao City police commander. So having won the election, one of Duterte's first priorities was to tamp down all of this other violence that was going on by insurgents, by vigilantes, by anti-communist groups, and that sort of thing. He wanted to be the only game in town. And how he did this was he exploited a fracture in the Communist New People's Army by playing one side against the other. So on one hand, he was working with the communists, at least one faction of the sort of Maoist faction of the communists. On the other hand, he was working with, and he was doing that by working with Alsamasa, the anti-communist group. So he sort of trained the violence from one side against the other. Later, Duterte did disband Alsamasa, but Paquibato district in Davao City remained for possibly until today a stronghold of Duterte's communist allies. And he also deftly balanced this alliance with the left, working with the military. Right? And we'll see this in greater detail later. But what he did was he appeased local military commanders, including with money, official financial transfers from the coffers of the city, to improve their facilities, probably for other reasons as well. And he also ensured that the communist insurgent groups were only active in the fringes of Davao City. So actually, when we look at my data, outside Davao City, a lot of the the counterinsurgency against the New People's Army and a lot of the conflict occurs just outside Davao City, but throughout the rest of the province of Davao, or the Davao provinces. So the death squad grew as Duterte consolidated his influence over the military and paramilitary groups. It grew from a handful of assassins to a shadow structure parallel to an official anti-crime task force funded by the city. Initially, it was meant, according to witnesses who had been part of the Davao Death Squad, it was initially meant to target organized crime like gang members, thieves, indeed drug addicts or drug criminals. In the Philippines, simply being addicted to drugs makes you a criminal, unfortunately, under the legal system. And so in this manner, Duterte developed monopolistic control over violence in Davao City. Famously, nothing happened without his knowledge or say. I mean, that's probably exaggerated, but it's also not that far from the truth. So it's in this environment that the Davao Death Squad operated unencumbered by rival armed groups. So from very few killings attributed to them in 1998, there were a couple. In 1999, that grew to about 16 killings, and about 11 killings are attributed to the Davao Death Squad in the year 2000. So with the Death Squad facilitating his control, Duterte could also co-opt rivals to his dominance later on that emerged. So going back to the military, in 2003 there was a terrorist bombing in Sasa Wharf and the Davao City Market, and this was attributed to the rebel group at the time, Moro Islamic Liberation Front. The president, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, declared emergency situation, increased police and military powers to deal with the terrorist attack. Crucially, the military established Task Force Davao in the city. Okay, so Task Force Davao was there, they did patrols, they conducted surveillance and so on. Ordinarily, when you have a military presence in something like an urban center, that's usually like a sign that the central government is trying to control local authorities. But in this case, Duterte again deftly played or manipulated the situation so that he actually had a lot of operational supervision and control even over the military commanders. And according to some investigations, including an investigation into private armed groups around the country, some members of the military participated in death squad violence. So, yes. Now, let's take a look at what this violence looks like. So this is yearly data, in contrast to what I showed you earlier at a much larger scale, which was weekly data. Okay, so about some of the worst years were 2008, which happened to be a year after an election, as well as 2005, also a year after an election. So again, there's like a lot of difference with traditional electoral violence, where the violence is usually before an election, not afterwards. I think this is because this is some sort of assertion of control, like, okay, elections are over. You know, the death squad tended to de-escalate during elections just to take the heat off a little bit, but then once he was back clearly in power, then the violence tended to ratchet up. And elections occur every 3 years, okay? And as you can see, the killings jump between 2001 to 2002 from about 20 to about 60, threefold. And then it's during this period that you see like these arcs of escalation. So I want to talk about why. So in 2001, after he won a re-election, he declared a war on drugs, right? And he vowed to eradicate drug crime from the city within months. I mean, these are some of the usual rhetorical devices that he would employ even later on as president. He read lists of targets on the radio, and after a day or two, unidentified gunmen on motorcycles would killed some people on those lists. The lists, as mentioned earlier, they came from sources like police anti-narcotics crime bureaus and barangay or village officials. So the death squad began targeting individuals with cases pending against them or people with a criminal record. And typically the targets or their families would learn either directly from barangay or police officials or indirectly that one of them was on the list, right? So you can see in Davao City very similar tactics as what happened later on at the national level. This is where it started, right? And so, what happened? Like, why was there this escalation? What happened was that Duterte started to get national attention and national support. And this was always a crucial part of Duterte's political success, his ability to manage relations upwards, right, with the president in particular. In July 2002, just after the election, when all of this violence was ramping up, President Arroyo, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, she praised Duterte's tough on crime tactics. She appointed him her national anti-crime czar, right? Like a consultant of the National Police Commission. And regionally, she appointed him into a pretty powerful position as chair of the Regional Peace and Order Council for the whole region of Davao. So not just his city, but beyond, right? Including other Davao provinces. And you know, this sort of national endorsement from no less than the president herself coincided with this ramping up of the violence. And in fact, it created such fear in Davao City when the president, when she announced a national anti-crime campaign, dozens of people in Davao City started surrendering themselves to the police. And that made them later on targets for the death squad. Speaking of that, just other ways that people became targets, ex-convicts, right? As soon as they've done their time, they were released from prison, they got targeted. Well, all of this to create that claim, bolster that claim that the vigilantes were cleansing society of unwanted elements. Now, okay, on September 6th, however, in 2003, remember June Pala? Gunmen shot him. And he was by then a radio journalist, right? And he had survived just a few months before a prior assassination attempt that he on the radio broadly hinted that Mayor Duterte was responsible. But then in September, the assassins finally got him. Okay. Now, the likelihood that Duterte was responsible is high. And I don't say this lightly. So let's fast forward to 2017. Duterte is president. Two former members of the death squad, one who was sort of lower level hitman, but one who was actually a senior police officer in the Davao Police, so that's all documented, came forward in Senate hearings and testified specifically that they were part of the hit on June Pala. That's number one. And number two, the former police officer Arthur Las Cañas testified in public on televised, it's all on YouTube, you can find it, that Rodrigo Duterte personally handed him the payment, 3 million pesos, or around $50,000. Okay, fully implicating Duterte in this particular murder. So these two former death squad members, Edgar Matubato and Arthur Las Cañas, they are currently in hiding, but they are recognized witnesses who will be testifying or have testified to the International Criminal Court. Okay, and by the way, those Senate hearings were chaired by former Senator Laila de Lima. And I'll talk about Laila de Lima again later. But shortly after those Senate hearings, she was arrested for trumped-up drug crime-related corruption, and she remains in detention on these trumped-up charges. I mean, 3 out of 4 cases she's already been exonerated, but she's still in detention to this day. Okay, so now back to 2004. In the absence of those witness testimonies that were still yet to come, okay? Nothing slowed down Duterte's political ascent. In fact, in 2004, he ran for re-election, and he ran unopposed. And in the Philippines, you can be the sole candidate. You can win as long as there's one vote, and presumably you vote for yourself. Right? So, and during this election, he again campaigned specifically on a platform of this vigilante justice. On the eve of the vote, he told a crowd, which gathered for a press conference, that if he won, more criminals will get killed. And indeed, weeks, months after he won, the violence did intensify. So at this stage, so I talked about how people got targeted, right? Around 2004, and you saw that sort of escalation towards 2005, the frequency of the killings ramped up. So sometimes as many as 5 people were killed in the same day. And those of us who lived through the national war on drugs, that's very familiar, because that is exactly the kind of scale that the violence occurred at back just a few years ago. In this case, in Davao City, it's a small place. You know, I mean, it's a city. It's the 3rd largest city in the country, but it's still a relatively small place. And most of the people who were killed were young men of the urban poor, young men and boys, just like Ian de Lozano's. Okay. Some of those who were killed in the days that followed his election in 2004 were on the list of alleged drug personalities that Duterte would have read even as far back as 2 years prior. So these were the kinds of performances, the kinds of things that that happened in Davao City. Okay, now let's look at the next escalation arc. And remember, 2008 was the peak, right? Okay. So over time, things started to get even weirder. So police started, in some cases, to claim that people, they were probably killed because they were drug criminals. Okay, so then other people would do some investigation, like the Commission on Human Rights, and they would find no clear evidence for why that claim would be made by the police. Okay, and then the myth of the death squad also started to become self-referential. So the death squad formula for violence became so familiar that the police, like that, right, began to use the logic openly. For instance, in 2006, a Coca-Cola bottling plant worker, his name was Hilario Ortega, he was shot dead. And police authorities believed that the motive had to be a personal grudge, because Mr. Ortega was a very nice man. No one had any, he was not a criminal, he had no criminal record. And so therefore, and I quote from the police files, he could not be a victim of summary execution that frequently transpires in this city, close quote. And so, this kind of thing started to happen, as the scale of the violence increased, even the targeting became less precise, to put it another way. But that was all a consequence of the ratcheting up of the violence. Now, you remember there was a decline, usually after, in 2006, the violence did decline a little bit, from 2005. It was likely in anticipation of elections in 2007. Okay. So, now what happens in 2007 is this. The alliance between President Arroyo and Mayor Duterte collapses. They were squabbling over, because they game elections basically. I mean, there's still an element of uncertainty when there are people running against you, but otherwise, you sort of try to divide and try to avoid those kind of one-on-one contests. So they were squabbling over the distribution of who runs where. So, for the easier wins, right? Particularly between Duterte, and I'm going to talk about this guy a bit later again, Congressman Prospero Nograles, who was, I think, basically at the time, Duterte's nemesis, but later on they become frenemies when he becomes president. But anyway, so there was that squabbling, and what happened was in Davao City, which is a rich vote bank, right, because it is a populous urban area, in the 2007 elections, the ultimate outcome is Duterte keeps his seat, no problem, and oppositionists win in elections. I mean, they get the highest voter shares in Davao City to the chagrin of President Arroyo, because that means he didn't do his job, right? He didn't support her candidates. So this is the beginning of the end for them. So, and she gets hell-bent on ending Duterte's political career. Now, she's done this in the past. So around the same, around the same time, actually, she basically also had a similar falling out with the governor of Abra, Vicente Valera, up in the north, and with the Hoson brothers, or the Hoson dynasty in Central Luzon, closer to Metro Manila, the capital. And because of those, the sort of collapse of those alliances, these long-standing dynasties who had been in the governor's office for decades, some of them 20, 30 years, those dynasties finally crumbled. And what she did, in fact, was in the case of Vicente Valera and Abra, the police, for the first time after years of trying, magically, were able to dismantle his private army. Okay? So she tried to do the same thing to Duterte. So the first major sign of Malacanang, the palace, it's shorthand for the president, it's the name of the presidential palace. The first sign of disfavor with Malacanang was his dismissal from the Regional Security Council, right? That's powerful. And to add insult to political injury, Arroyo appointed the family member of this Nograles nemesis, right? Who was himself a governor of Davao del Sur, Douglas Caldas, okay? And then, remember Task Force Davao, the military outpost in the city. So they were really friendly with Duterte, right? They were getting money from the city government. So a new commander is put in charge, less friendly, okay? And the things happen like, so Duterte had this sort of arrangement with the left, right? And this is a whole other story about the Philippines at this time, where a lot of leftist activists are getting killed by the military all over the country, but not in Davao City. So Cesar Pojas, who is with the Kilusang Magbubukid ng Pilipino, a peasant group, gets killed after this new commander shows up in Davao City. So that's also another sign that Duterte's power or control may be slipping. He can't guarantee security anymore for his left-wing allies. And then Task Force Davao also rolled out this extensive barangay defense system for counterinsurgency, mobilizing as many as 4,000 militia members and recruiting barangay officials or village officials into this militia. And Duterte didn't like that, right? Because he's supposed to be the only game in town, right? And then he's going to, all his trusted lieutenants at the village level. So Duterte warned the military to stop. The military basically ignored him and continued with their plans. And moreover, it started to look like Duterte's impunity for the Davao Death Squad killings was beginning to end. So two major things happened. One, the UN Special Rapporteur for Extrajudicial Killings made a special visit to Davao City, in addition to his overall investigation of extrajudicial killings in the country. And he made, in particular, like a certain point, there's a whole Davao City and Davao Death Squad chapter in his report to the United Nations, where he notes that, look, the so-called Death Squad members are killing people openly. They're not even wearing masks. This is a sign that they're not afraid of any sort of legal consequences for what they're doing, which is therefore another sign that there is, state sanction, right? State involvement, meaning the local government, in what was happening. So that was one. This was in 2007, early 2008. So the killings kind of died down. Died down is a really bad choice of words. The killings declined while Philip Elston was in Davao. But then when he left, 2008, as you recall, was another sort of, it's the peak of the killings, right? And, but then, because of that, in 2009, and here she is again, Laila de Lima. So this is 2009, before she becomes senator. She is first a newly appointed or recently appointed chair of the Commission on Human Rights. She has the temerity also to go to Davao City, to his town, right? And she conducts public hearings on the war on the Davao Death Squad, right? So she interviews police officers, barangay officials. She interviews Duterte, and they have this public, sort of sparring as part of these hearings. And she makes a really good point in an unpublished report, or rather a preliminary version of the report from that investigation. It's not a death squad, it's a system, right? It's institutionalized. And there's all this evidence of city payments and recruitment, and obviously the mayor with his rhetoric and that sort of thing. It's a system, right? Okay, so you'd think that should have stopped him, right? But no. Unfortunately, even with all of that, one other thing is that up until that point, Arroyo had his back, right? But then when the Commission on Human Rights decides to do this forum, President Arroyo is like, you have my blessings, right? Go after him. But it still doesn't work because there are elections. Oh. Sorry. Thank you. Okay. So I'm just going to continue, okay? So what happens is there are elections. And so this, on one hand, all of these investigations occur at a time where Duterte is actually particularly vulnerable because he's at the end of his last possible term for re-election. There's a three-term consecutive limit, okay? So he can't run for mayor in 2010. Blood was definitely in the water, and rivals circled closer. Arroyo shifted her support very clearly to Nograles, okay, who decides to this time run for mayor, directly challenging Duterte, who can't run, but his daughter Sarah runs for mayor instead, okay? So, in a play for a new patron, Duterte endorses the candidacy of Benigno Noynoy Aquino, who's running for president. He's the son of democracy icon and former president. It's a family business. Corazon Aquino, okay? And in the end, he holds on, okay? So this kind of thing, these are elections, right? And there are uncertainties. Even if Arroyo was able to dislodge other local strongmen, those also happened when she was in a stronger position. Because by 2010, she's also at the end of her term. It's a lame duck time for her. She's just trying to get her anointed successor elected, but she fails, right? Because Aquino wins. The reformist Aquino wins. And so in Davao City, Sara Duterte wins for mayor, and Rodrigo Duterte, beating Nograles, by the way. And Duterte himself runs for vice mayor, so that's the tandem. It's a family business, right? And Arroyo's coalition is roundly defeated in the 2010 polls, and Aquino is now in Malacanang. Okay, So in 2013, Duterte is again eligible to run for mayor. He runs against 4 unknown opponents. His son, Paulo, wins also unopposed for vice mayor. Now, what happens there is that the death squad killings overall just decline until 2016, probably in preparation for Duterte's run for the presidency. Right? Okay, and then Duterte in 2016, right? Okay, I'm just going to fast forward a little bit. He wins. He wins for president. And outgoing Justice Secretary Emmanuel Caparas, days after it's clear, or days after President-elect Duterte, is the clear winner, announces that the government was at a dead end of its investigations in Davao City. Because the way it works is this Commission on Human Rights recommends prosecution. This has to be then done by the department, the Justice Department, right? And so on. Duterte's president now, case closed then, right? And this is the tragedy. Because if Duterte had been tried, convicted, and imprisoned, then the war on drugs and all that mass atrocity, mass killing wouldn't have happened. Okay, so what does this all sort of boil down to? Okay, so this table is just like a sort of summary to see it as a process, and also to facilitate a comparison, which I will be brief on, of 2 other cases. So this is what we discussed. What I talked about earlier. There is an accommodation with the government. The president and the mayor are allies. The president praises, enables, rewards Duterte for his violent approach to crime. The violence escalates. She tries to crack down on him. She tries to crack down on the death squad and Duterte himself politically when their alliance collapses. There are all these shifts against him, including the military and human rights investigations and so on. But she's unsuccessful. The violence declines somewhat in Davao City, but it escalates nationally after Duterte becomes president. Okay? And so just to facilitate the comparison, I'll talk a little bit about the Tagum City Death Squad. I think I don't have time to go into great detail. But just think of it as a copycat attempt, okay? So in Tagum City, which is not far from Davao, Mayor Reynaldo Uy, okay, he, after sort of unstable time for him, he was mayor, he lost re-election, and then in 2004, he's back, okay? But he didn't like losing. So what he did in 2004 was he starts to emulate the death squad in Davao City, which is completely separate enterprises, okay? Just, he follows the same sort of modus operandi. So dozens of killings start to occur, 2004, 2005, 2006, and so on, till about 2012, I think. And it's the same sort of playbook. Mayor Uy says, "Oh, these criminals, they're weeds. We need to pull them out. We need to clean society of them, and so on." People start talking about the existence of a death squad. The difference with Mayor Uy, Tagum Mayor Uy, is that he had a bit of a higher propensity to go after opponents. Whereas Duterte did do that, like in the case of Jun Pala, but he did it very rarely. Okay? Also, they liquidated witnesses to the death squad crimes. This happened a lot. I'm guessing their command structure was a little loose. They had a lot of potential witnesses to testify against them. So the government does, in this case, effectively cracks down on the Tagum death squad. So some explanation that I offer here is that there's no alliance with the president. There's not even an alliance with the governor of Davao del Norte, which is where the city is sort of part. It's the province in which the city is a component, right? And it's the governor, for some political reason that is unclear, but it's the governor that initiates first initiates an investigation against the Tagum City Death Squad. The National Bureau of Investigation, the NBI, kind of like the FBI, they get involved, right? Now, ultimately, Uy is not convicted, but he's finished politically. Once he loses elections, he never gets reelected. Okay? The violence does decline, and it results in the actual dismantling of an armed group in society. So the Philippine state, the government has this capacity when it's properly motivated, or when it doesn't have any when it doesn't have a motivation against moving or going after certain local groups. Now, another case that I'll go through very briefly is the Red Vigilante Group. Okay, now this is in a completely different location. It's in the province of Nueva Ecija, or actually it operated from 2001 to 2003 in the between the border of Nueva Ecija and Bulacan provinces, which are both very close to Metro Manila. So what happened here is that the Red Vigilante Group is a sort of was a rump of a rump. So, or the original organization is the Communist New People's Army, which, you know, is waging an insurgency even to this day throughout the country, right? But they had different commands in different regions, and they had one command in Negros province in the Visayas area, south of Manila, and this was called. So they broke away from the New People's Army and called themselves the Revolutionary Proletariat Army Alex Bongkayaw Bibili, RPA ABB. Okay. Now these guys were the Nueva Ecija-based faction linked to the RPA ABB. Okay. Okay. So what happened is that under the previous president before Arroyo, okay, I'm not going to get into it. His name was Joseph Estrada. He was a movie actor. He was very corrupt. Got impeached, but that didn't prosper. People protested. He resigned, but actually he was deposed because the military sided with the vice president, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, who then becomes president in 2001. So when she becomes president, the peace process that the RPA-ABB had with the previous government, that suddenly becomes unstable. And then this Red Vigilante Group suddenly is like left in Nueva Ecija province with all these arms, you know, all these fighters, but no clear affiliation anymore, especially as the peace process sort of, with the RPA-ABB, as that peace process sort of drags on. And so they're sort of left to operate. It's a sort of passive accommodation by the government. Because they start targeting so-called criminals, saying that it's part of their peace deal with the government. That's their job now, to go after criminals, revolutionary justice. Okay? But then in 2003, finally, Arroyo decides to continue with the implementation of the peace deal with the bigger, let's call them the medium-sized group, the RPA-ABB, right? Leaving the Red Vigilante Group in the lurch. They're not part of the peace deal. And so the military cracks down on the group, captures and kills the leaders. Violence completely declines in the sense that because the RVG is defunct. I mean, they operated for a short period of time, not too many, maybe about 60 people, 40 to 60 people killed in the course of 2 years. But also following this anti-crime performance. Okay, literature. Okay, but I have to be really, really brief, right? So, how do we then overall, or how do I try to understand this and explain this to you? It's from the vantage of the Philippines being a weak state. Now, different scholars have different ideas of how exactly is the Philippine state weak, right? Some people think, oh, it's clientelism because of patrons and clients and this reciprocal relationship that gets activated through patronage, maintained through patronage and activated during elections, right? The problem with that explanation is it doesn't really account for coercion and violence. On the other hand, another very important explanation is, it's the oligarchy. The government acts in service of class interests, right? And local strongmen emerge in the post-war period as a product of this class conflict. Now, the problem with that explanation, as John Seidel points out, is that actually these local bosses, like Duterte, they're not part of the landed class. They're more closely tied to getting rents from the state or from illicit criminal activities. And so he argues, actually, his concept of bosses then is that, the Philippine state is actually strong because it can penetrate society, but predate as well on society, okay? The academic consensus is, even in comparative literature, comparing the Philippines to other Southeast Asian countries, is the state is weak. And what, in contrast as well to Seidel, what Giorgio Abenales says is that, actually during the post-war state formation period, these local strongmen helped to give a political focus to a very weak state. That's how a weak state governs, right? Okay, so my contribution is that, this mutual accommodation, maybe it worked for a certain, and Abenales admits this, because then the contours of violence change after that immediate post-war period, and not the least by martial law, okay? So what I try to contribute is this notion that a weak state, like the Philippines, needs to govern a society fragmented by various armed groups, including these local crime campaigns, local anti-crime campaigns, but there are also local crime campaigns, right, murder, run by these strongmen in society. And so failing to achieve a Weberian sort of monopoly on violence, a weak state regulates violence, right? It can't monopolize, but it can regulate violence. So to conclude, as we've seen in these cases, the government, through state security forces on one hand, and institutions of democratic accountability on the other hand, sought to stop Duterte and Davao City, tried to take him to account for the violence of the Davao Death Squad, but they failed. They failed, but it was kind of a close shave for Duterte, right? I argue that a weak state like the Philippines therefore regulates violence. Regulation being a strategic goal, to strengthen its autonomy from social forces, but then constrained by the same social forces, right? Especially powerful elites. And so while Arroyo and Duterte for a time were political allies, when they were political allies, the government actively turned a blind eye to Davao violence and even legitimized its tactics, encouraged the violence inadvertently to escalate. So Duterte enjoyed that sort of local strongman accommodation from the central government. But then, crucially, Arroyo facilitated impunity for him in Davao City. Now, in contrast, the government successfully dismantled a similar vigilante group, right, in Tagum City and other armed groups like the Red Vigilante Group. So accommodation tactics seem to encourage violence, while crackdowns can lead, and a weak state can do it under certain circumstances and motivated by certain interests. The state can crack down and reduce violence in society. Okay, so thank you very much.